Please do not turn off your radio, but turn up the volume on your receiver as high as it can go.
I want everybody in the place to be. To make some noise if you're down with me. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Welcome to Social Disruption, the show that shatters comfort zones, flips the script, and delivers unfiltered truth. I'm your host, Farrah, and joining me is my co-host.
I'm Cheyenne, and together we're here to disrupt the airways with real conversations, no filters, no apologies.
Trigger warning, this is a show where a spine isn't optional and the truth cuts deep. Let's get into it. Disruptors, buckle up because tonight we're diving headfirst into a conversation that most people are too scared to have. Our guest, Jack Kammer, has spent decades challenging the status quo on gender issues, not just for women, but for men too. And trust me, he's got the receipts. Jack worked as a correctional officer in one of Baltimore's toughest detention centers, where he saw firsthand how the system fails men, especially those society has written off. He later became a parole and probation agent, then shifted gears to work with the National Fatherhood Initiative, running programs that helped incarcerated fathers reconnect with their kids. Because when men are given the tools to be better fathers, families and communities thrive. But Jack didn't stop there. Oh no, he's been making feminists sweat since the 80s, hosting radio shows that tackled the hard conversations about gender nobody else wanted to touch. His book, Goodwill Toward Men, was so controversial it was effectively buried by his own publisher for daring to question feminist orthodoxy. And when it came to getting men's issues recognized at a legislative level, Jack worked alongside powerhouse leaders like Elijah Cummings to push for real conversations about the struggles men face, fighting to get men a damn seat at the table. In a world where equity and inclusion are trendy buzzwords, Jack is here to remind us that real inclusivity means acknowledging everyone's struggles, including men's. He's been fighting this fight for decades, and tonight we're giving him the mic. Thank you, Jack, for joining Cheyenne and I.
Thank you. That is about the best introduction of myself I've ever heard. I want to meet this guy.
Come on now.
Oh.
You have the backing to prove what a staple you are in this generation to help men gain their strength back that they've lost, I think, more in the last 4 years than any time. But before we do dive deep, what was your childhood like, Jack, as far as any defining moments that shaped your views on gender and society?
Yes, I can trace it back to when I was a kid, probably, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, something like that. Let me compare it first with something that you are familiar with, and then I'll introduce you to this idea that happened to me that you're probably not familiar with. You know how it's not a good thing to say to girls who are good at sports, gee, Susie, you're really good at sports, ... for a girl, or gee, Mary, you're really good at math and science, ... for a girl. We know that's not a good thing to say. And we also know that saying that is sort of connected. It's probably definitely deeply connected to very old ideas about the proper roles of males and females. And it's bad to say that to little girls because it makes them think, well, I've got this great talent, I've got this ability, I've got this interest, but I'm supposed to waste it because I'm a girl. I'm not supposed to develop this or implement this or deploy this in my life. Well, what I used to hear as a kid, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, was, gee, Jack, you're really good with babies, ... for a boy. And I had no way to articulate what was going on, but I knew that I didn't like that. Something was up with that. And since then, growing to be an adult and having spent decades thinking about male gender issues, I think I know that what it's about is telling me telling other boys who hear such messages that that's not really your territory. That's not for you. That's for women, and you should leave it to women. You shouldn't try to deploy or develop these skills and talents and abilities and channels for happiness and fulfillment in your life. That's not for you. So that was my first inkling that something was up. And I think it really sort of speaks volumes to the central problem that I would love to talk about, because my mission in life is to sort of deflate or tarnish a little bit the halo that surrounds feminism. It is sort of our state sociological religion. And anybody who dares to suggest that feminism doesn't know the whole truth and nothing but the truth about men, and doesn't always tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth about men, is a misogynist. You must be a woman hater. You must have hated your mother. You must be a divorced father who's bitter about paying child support and alimony. All of that nonsense. People like me, and there are plenty of us, who challenge. I call myself the counter-feminist rather than an anti-feminist. I think feminism started out doing some good things, but it has sort of lost its way. So people like me believe that the good things that feminism did in its early days, probably going back to before World War II, when women started making noises like, they wanted to do more than be housewives and raise kids. Not that they didn't like that, but they wanted more. Too much of any good thing can be a bad thing. During the war, the iconic character or cartoon image illustration of Rosie the Riveter in a bandana, in a blue shirt, with her sleeves rolled up, I think she's flexing her muscles. And the caption over the image issued by the United States government to try to get women to come and help build ships was, "We can do it." And she was a beloved character to women right after the war. And she demonstrated, at least in that illustration and in the fact that there were thousands of women who became riveters and helped build ships and helped win the war, she sparked in women the idea that, we don't have to listen to all this nonsense about how women are weak and women cry too much and women just want to file their nails and all of those millions of stereotypes. We want to do more. Well, in 1963, Betty Friedan was a woman in New York who was a very successful magazine writer. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, and it's largely credited with sparking the current wave of the women's movement. When I went back to read that book about 10 years ago, I expected, based on what I knew about what feminism had become, I was expecting to read a book that was very mean and dismissive and sarcastic and nasty toward men. But it was not at all that way. Not at all. Betty Friedan did not blame men for the fact that women needed liberation. She blamed the culture. It was the idea that men have to do this and women have to do that is a vestige of our ancient times when we were a little band of hominids walking across the grasslands of the Serengeti in distinct danger of being wiped out as a species by an attack of a saber-toothed tiger, for instance. And so it became necessary to eke out every bit of efficiency we could out of what we could do as males and females, and we had to specialize. Women had to specialize in taking care of the babies. Men had to specialize in taking care of the saber-toothed tigers in a very negative way. Keep killing them, keeping them away. So Betty Friedan's book recognized also that it wasn't just women who were hampered in their options and how they could choose to live their lives. She even mentioned in her book an article that was in Red Book magazine, which was, I don't know if it still is, was a very big influential women's magazine in the 60s. She referred to a magazine article in Red Book 1962 that was titled "Young Husbands Feel Trapped." And she cited that article not as a means of saying, do you see how men are hating women and blaming women for everything? No, she cited it to say that men aren't exactly having a picnic either. So I was very happy to read that, and it made me feel much better about Betty Friedan and the beginnings of the women's movement, but it made me feel much worse about how feminism had lost its way. I want to talk to you about what I see happening in the late 60s through the 70s and into the early 80s that really deserves to be criticized, because the way I think I can describe it with historical facts, it's pretty clear that feminism is anything but, these days, I should say, these days is anything but a progressive movement. And it's very much about digging in its heels.
I want to touch on, you had mentioned earlier, I've always been curious since I did not live in that time period, in the time when women were the ones that picked up the slack back at home when the men did go off to war. How did that come about in those times? Women were the ones to stay in the kitchen, but then you saw them working in factories more. Can you just tell us, how did that go about?
Well, at the time of World War II, I think what happened to cause Rosie the Riveter phenomenon was that the government sort of begged and pleaded and said, hey, please come, we need you. And women, patriots, patriotic as they were, many of them said, yeah, I want to do that. I can do that. I want to pitch in that way. And of course, there were also women who were called WACs, the Women's Army Corps. I think the Navy had something called the Waves. And lots of women contributed in lots of different ways to the war effort.
And please continue on the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because I was born in 76. So I'd love to know your take on those generations.
Okay. Very good. Okay. So I should mention that Betty Friedan, following the success in the early 60s, mid 60s, following the great success of her book, The Feminine Mystique, which really did spark in women the sort of the unspoken, and maybe it wasn't even, considered normal. If you were a woman who didn't want to stay home with your kids and be a homemaker, maybe there was something wrong with you, So she sparked it, and women started talking about it. And so the women's movement arose, and they said, look, being a homemaker's good. We enjoy it. We love being mothers. We love being good spouses. We love our husbands, but we want to also have an equal share of what has traditionally been the sole domain of men, corporate jobs, careers, politics, being scientists, being lawyers, being astronauts. John Glenn orbited the Earth in 62. So that was all happening in the early 60s. The women's movement was trying to build its ranks. It wanted more and more women to become members of the women's movement. They had a problem, though, because a lot of women were saying that a lot of women who were not so happily married and weren't so enamored of the idea of being wives and mothers had a problem because they weren't talking up the wonders and the values of being wives and mothers. They actually talked about that as being a form of oppression. And many women who were happy with their husbands and their roles as mothers in families were a little skeptical at this approach. Men are oppressors and marriage is a prison for women. And so at the same time, there were men like me. I was born in 51. There were a lot of men back in that era who started hearing about the women's movement and how it was going to dismantle sexism. Good women like Betty Friedan acknowledged that sexism harmed both sexes. And so men like me started thinking, well, this is going to be good for us, going to be good for men, because if roles are equally divided between men and women, we will be less pressured to make all the money in the family, and we will have closer relationships with our kids. And remember here, I was a young man who really loved babies and kids. I have a very strong paternal instinct, I guess. And I'm not the only one. There were lots of us, but Just as it was kind of weird and maybe even shameful for a woman back in the middle of the 20th century to question whether maybe she didn't want to be a full-time homemaker, even though she loved her kids. She wanted more. There was a lot of discussion about, wow, what's wrong with her? And any woman who wanted to be a lawyer, oh my God, she's really off her rocker. Women aren't supposed to want to argue. Women are supposed to be nice and sweet and to have everybody get along. And a woman who wants to go into court and kick butt, something wrong with her. I'm not saying that for myself, but that was a suspicion of women who wanted more. And it was sort of weird for us men to be talking out loud about, we really don't like this corporate gig that we've got, where we got to work 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week in an office far away from our kids. It's not very fulfilling. We don't really like a lot of what the bosses are having us do. And so men, too, were interested in getting into non-traditional space for their gender. So we were interested in not having to focus entirely on making money and having much better relationships, equal relationships with our kids.
Why do you think that is, Jack, that so many people struggle to acknowledge that a man can be at home and be a stay-at-home dad, and the woman can be someone that's strong in her career, but also her faith and her family? Why do you think that there is so many people that struggle with acknowledging that?
I think it's much less operating against women today, at least overtly, and still operating pretty strongly against men. I think the reason people believed that was because it was what they had always had. And there were people who could quote verses from the Bible to justify men do this and women do that. I mean, there's even the verse that's often read at weddings about, when I became a man, I gave up childish things, which was sort of a way of saying, when you get married, what you got to do is buckle down, stop having any fun, and make money. That's how you show your love for your family. You are going to be the provider. And women were going to be at home with the kids, and that's worked for us for hundreds and thousands of years. It must be the way it's supposed to be. And so that's our story, and we're sticking with it. So I think that's why it needed to be justified, because it was the status quo, and change is not only difficult, it can be scary. So people who are willing to venture out and make change, they're risk takers. They're willing to try new things, and not everybody is willing to try new things. There's a lot of security in the status quo.
So when you talk about trying to learn new things, trying to uncondition ourselves to what we've kind of all grown up with and what we've known, how do we really start integrating men's well-being into mainstream conversations without it turning into a divisive us versus them issue?
I think that given the status quo that we have right now, and given how pervasive the current strain of feminism in our politics, in our media, in the minds of regular women who are sometimes not crazy, radical, strident feminists, but regular women are very ready sometimes to take umbrage at any suggestion that might, from a man, that might be in any way considered sexist. And so it's very easy for men to get dragged into contentiousness of the war of the sexes, and it's sort of unavoidable. I mean, really and truly, it is quite frequent, quite common, that the kinds of things that I've been saying so far would qualify me very clearly, undoubtedly, in the minds of many women as making me a misogynist. That if I dare to say that men, too, suffer from sexism, the way I like to say it is, the most sexist idea of all is that only men are ever sexist and only women are ever harmed by sexism. What I'm really saying is some women are sexist too, and some men, many men from time to time, maybe all men somewhere in their lives in very important ways, are harmed by sexism. Men and women are equal in the context of their embrace of traditional gender roles. Just saying that can brand me as a misogynist. So what I therefore say is the biggest cause of misogyny right now, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, but misogyny is the idea of the hatred of women, and anybody who's a misogynist is a woman hater. I think it's fair to say that the biggest cause of misogyny right now is the overuse of the word misogyny. Because in today's climate, in today's gender relations climate, where it has entirely been controlled, dominated, defined, the whole agenda set by women, it's inevitable that there are going to be some men who are going to be feeling, well, wait a second, that's not fair. I mean, what about some goodies coming toward us in our direction? Whatever happened to the idea that we weren't going to be primarily responsible for making money and we were going to have equal relationships with our kids? But, divorce laws really haven't changed all that much. And even though women are making money, they still expect men to pay for the first date. Men are feeling not exactly, tickled pink by all of the women in the dating market. And so if they dare to say anything that's not 100% positive about how wonderful women are, they're misogynists.
Might I add something onto that? It is funny. The past few years, especially, we have seen women want to take this more independent stance. And even though I'm a woman, I do not, how do I want to say this, rule along with the majority of the new age women who are, let me pay for the first date. You don't have to do it. I want to be more independent. But yet, when it comes down to who's going to fight in our military, you see less of women. They only want to be independent and strong in the areas they feel glorify them. This is my opinion. But how do you respond, Jack, to people that argue that men already hold societal power? How do you respond to that when discussing men's issues?
The way I respond to it is by saying yes, and that's what counter-feminists do. The anti-feminists say, no, that's a bunch of baloney. Men don't have any power. Women have all the power. No, a counter-feminist says yes, and the and part is yes, men have had powers in traditional male spheres. Government, politics, the male power structure is, in my view, pretty easily, and I think pretty commonly regarded as a hierarchy, sort of a pyramid. And because of this fascination the human mind has with looking up, we inevitably look up at this pyramid and say, wow, that's really way far up there. And we don't want to look at the bottom of the pyramid and say the men who are stuck at the bottom of the male hierarchy really don't have much power at all. What we do in our gender discourse is to think about male power, and we talk about the Fortune 500, the men at the top. We don't talk about the misfortune 5 million, men at the men at the bottom. And so, yes, men have had power in some domains, business, politics, academia. There are places where men have a lot of power, and there are good things that come out of these places. But not every man benefits hugely from being a man. The men at the top have very little interest, very little concern about the men at the bottom. We could say that's the yes. Yes, men do have power. The yes and says, and there's also a female power structure.
100%.
Absolutely.
At the top of the male power structure, at the pointy tippy top where there aren't a whole lot of men, there is a dollar sign. The female power structure is not a hierarchy. It's actually not even standing very tall. It's more like a convention center. It doesn't have 62 stories in the office building. It might have only 2 or 3 stories in the convention center. It doesn't rise very high, but it occupies 14 acres. And at the center of the female power structure, it's not a dollar sign, it's a heart. And we know, or should know, and should be willing to acknowledge that just as the dollar sign is a good thing that men have had primary access to, the heart is also a very good thing that men deserve, need, and want. And just as men developed a lot of stereotypes about women to justify keeping women out of traditional male space, we could spend a half an hour listing the anti-female stereotypes. I'll just throw out a few. Women aren't strong. They aren't logical. They can't do math. They cry too much. They just want to make everybody get along. They can't make tough decisions. Go on and on about why women don't belong in the rough and tumble male domain. Well, I think it's also not very difficult, especially these days, to come up with a whole lot of negative stereotypes about men. And just as the stereotypes that I mentioned about women were very nicely aimed, very aligned with the idea of keeping women out of business and politics and academia and science, the stereotypes that are very much at work still about men are, I believe, very finely and not by accident tuned to the idea that men cannot be and should not be, essentially by virtue of their human nature as men, they cannot be equals to women in the family and in the raising of children. And I think that that is the essential problem that men are facing in what feminism is doing these days. Now, it is true that if you're a woman who has a really great career, maybe you're a tenure track professor and you're doing really interesting research, or you're really enjoying teaching the way you're teaching, and your career's going great and it's really fun, you want to find a man who would be willing to support you in that career by doing more than the traditional man does at home. No doubt about that. There certainly are women who want to welcome men into equality in the home. However, there are some limitations and qualifications to that. Even women who have fabulous careers and really do want to be equals at home, supporting the woman's careers, it also still happens that divorces occur. And in those cases, even those women who have, for the past several years, done everything they can to get their men to invest heavily in their roles at home. They've invested heavily by taking a huge cut in salary, perhaps. They've invested heavily by putting their hearts, their emotions, their love very, very deeply and strongly into forging primary relationships with their kids. Those investments, those sacrifices, well, it's not a sacrifice if you have a close relationship with your kid, but those investments you've made in your future happiness can be completely and easily blown up by the mother saying, "Oh, Joe, you've been a great father and a great husband, and I really appreciate everything you've done for me. But, I've fallen in love with Larry, my tennis instructor, and we're running off to Idaho. And of course, I'm taking the kids. And thank you. You can come out a couple of times every summer and see the kids and fly out a couple of times when you can afford it. Maybe even have them stay overnight with you in a motel out there." That kind of thing. Even the women who have fabulous careers leave their men possibly in danger of losing all of that. Now, that's the best case scenario. We also need to recognize that there are a lot of women who do not have fabulous careers. A lot of women just have jobs, just 9 to 5. They can't wait to get out of there and get home. Where do they want to get home to? They want to get home to their house, to their home, to their family, to their kids. That's what they want. And many women regard themselves as sort of the CEOs of their little power structures, their little corporations. They're the primary person who runs the house, and the house and the home is the female domain. And many women have as much trouble letting men into equality in their domains as, the male bricklayer at the union hall had difficulty welcoming women who wanted to be bricklayers into the union. So, think of the situation, the risky situation that men are in terms of how they invest in their future happiness. Imagine that the situation in corporations today, where women are doing pretty well, a lot of women are rising up through management, a lot of middle managers, a lot of women having pretty interesting careers, pulling down some good money. Imagine if the situation were that any man in that corporation at any time could say to her, "We don't need you anymore. I'm going to stay in this job. I'm going to get that promotion, and you're fired." We would never tolerate that. To allow a woman's career, her investment in her career, all of her training, all of her heart and soul, blood, sweat, and tears, to be just blown up by a man saying, You're gone.
Let
Well,
me
that's
ask
the
you
si-
something, Jack, with what you had mentioned just a few minutes ago. Men, and as much as they try hard to create and provide for their family, then they get the wife that is saying, you got to have this great job. We need to pay bills. But then they end up falling in love with their tennis instructor. Let me bring up case in point Tom Brady, wonderful quarterback, Super Bowl winner, married to Giselle, supermodel, and she had supported him for so many years. He retired, if you remember, and then he got back in and was playing down in Florida. What happened? She ended up leaving him, wanting a divorce. And guess what? She's pregnant with her ninja or whatever instructor. I've always wanted to ask a man's point. It seems like you can't win. How is that, Jack? That there's women that can want that, the providing and everything. And then when they do their job and they know it's what they're loved. I know there are other people, blue collar workers, that are in the same situation at times. They get this job, truck driver, working on the road. The wife knows when they marry them, this is their job. This is what they have to do. Start having some kids and they start being upset. You're not meeting at the kids' sports. You're not there to see their spelling bee. It just seems like a losing battle.
Well, we're definitely losing the battle, and that's because I don't think men have joined the fray. We are afraid of being called misogynist. We're afraid of getting a bad reputation at work, especially if we have a job that is, or we work for an organization like a university or a big corporation that is very concerned about a Twitter storm. You know, they have to do everything right according to the principles of current feminism. So it is a losing battle, but it doesn't have to be a losing battle because you know why? Guess what? There are people like you and Cheyenne who can help and encourage and say, come on, guys, don't listen to that. Don't believe you're a misogynist just because you're standing up for yourself. We've got your backs. We'll help you out. But men need to sort of step up first before we can ask women to back us up. It is a very scary time to be a man who has any qualms about being a man and any unhappy feelings about the ways women sort of take advantage of their current political situation, where it's all about the women's vote and don't make women mad and believe the woman, all of the uneven playing field that we play on. What you're pointing to sort of speaks to the missions that I feel that I'm on. Back in the early 50s, you probably never heard of this. Joseph McCarthy was a senator in the United States Senate, and he conducted the Army McCarthy hearings, and he was on a witch hunt for communists in the federal government. And he was on a rampage, and everybody was afraid of him. Nobody would speak up against him until this one man, I think his name was Joseph Welch, who during a hearing just perfectly, I have a sound bite of it. I could play for you if you want to hear it. Can I
I would
do it or
love
something?
to. Yes.
Okay,
please.
here we go.
Let us not assassinate this lad further. Senator, look what you have done enough. Have you no sense, decency, long laugh? Have you left no sense of peace?
It was as if the entire country had been waiting for somebody to finally say this line. Have you no sense of decency?
I'm hoping that the nation is ready to say to feminism, have you no sense of decency? Take a look at how many men are committing suicide. Take a look at deaths of despair. Take a look at how many boys are committing suicide. Have you no sense of decency? Haven't you done enough? Can we put some focus on men now and boys now, please? And I think the nation might be getting ready to say that. And I think that the election we just had indicates that there are a lot of folks who are thinking that the male point of view is, as much as I'm not crazy about Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt off at the Republican convention, just having some celebration of things that are male is long overdue. We need it again. I wouldn't make Hulk Hogan my avatar of my ideal kind of maleness or masculinity, but he's a man and he's a good man. I like to talk about alpha males and alphabet males. People like Hulk Hogan's an alpha male. Tom Brady, probably an alpha male. Okay, so if you're a woman and you got an alpha male, How long is it going to take you to get bored with hearing ah, ah, a, ah? Pretty boring. I call myself an alphabet male because I want to have the whole range of human experience and emotions and expressiveness in my repertoire.
Jack, we know that there has been such a stigma around men showing vulnerability, but there is a vacillating that we all go through with all of our emotions. I really liked your point about the women's center being the heart and the men's top being the dollar sign. And since you're on this path, when we talk about that cycle that we're in, where men showing vulnerability is looked at as a negative thing, or if they show what's perceived to be as weakness. How do you think that that cycle is going to break?
I would say, and I have said, something we ought to think about. We need to meet men where they are. And right now, a lot of men do not want to admit any kind of vulnerability because, as you point out, it sort of suggests weakness and inability to take care of your own problems. I would suggest that a better word than telling men to be vulnerable, I would suggest that a better thing to encourage men to do is to say, I'm in danger. I'm in danger here. I'm in emotional danger. I'm in danger with my family. I'm in danger with my job. I'm in danger with losing my friends. This is not a healthy, safe way for men to live. We're in danger here, and we're going to fix the things that jeopardize us. I think that's probably, for many men, better than asking them to admit their vulnerabilities. It amounts to the same thing, but the emphasis is slightly different. Yes, men are vulnerable, but they're in danger of being hurt. That's really a more male attractive way to put it.
Instead of using the word vulnerable. I can understand that. We're talking about men wanting to have stronger male figures, but ones that can show a range of emotions. So if you don't mind, I would like to ask you the questions that my son, who is a high school freshman, had for you. And one of them was, how would you advise that high school aged male students bring awareness to Men's Mental Health Month in June?
You don't have to invent the wheel here because there are organizations that you could tap into. Look up the Men's Health Network in Washington, D.C. I think it's menshealthnetwork.org. And they try to make a celebration out of Men's Health Month every June, which is the month that Father's Day falls in. So if you could say you've got 6 fellas and some women too, some girls too, saying we want to do something for Men's Health Month because we care about ourselves, each other. We care about our brothers, our fathers, our uncles. We want to put on something for Men's Health Month. They might say, oh boy, that's a new thing on us. What do you have in mind? But they very well might say, yeah, great. We know exactly. We've got some posters to send you. We've got some flyers to send you, whatever. That's some place to start at least. Men's Health Network.
That's a really great resource to have. And I know that he has been an advocate, and his lacrosse team, they have been very strong advocates in middle school and now moving into high school of trying to get the word out about Men's Mental Health Awareness Month.
Men's Health Network is called the Men's Health Network. And the reason they focus on health is because health includes everything: mental health, physical health, emotional health, spiritual health. They focus primarily, I think I'm right in saying that they focus primarily on men's physical health. I know there are other organizations that focus on men's mental health. So I would get on the internet and poke around, do some searches, find people who have organizations and institutions devoted to men's mental health and ask them the same questions. What can you do to help us? We want to help you. What can you do to help us help you? Spread the word at the high school level, which would be great, about men's health and men's mental health.
I completely agree with you there. For his next question, he would like to know, what can young men do to gain acceptance and acknowledgement for their emotions and struggles without being told to, quote, suck it up or, quote, act like a man? You know, those are two phrases that are constantly told, even to this day, to our young men and boys.
Yeah, and man up is another one that's really
Yeah.
not very helpful, right? Okay, so I guess what I would say is when the women's movement started, it was very difficult for them too. The early suffragettes, the women who wanted the vote, they were jailed. They were locked up. Some of them were beaten. Some of them were force-fed in prisons. It was not easy. It's not easy to be on the bleeding edge. It's why they call it the bleeding edge. It's not easy. Now, I don't think that high school boys today are in danger of being physically assaulted, but emotionally assaulted is probably inevitable. And you got to be with your buddies and say, look, this is going to happen. And you know what we're going to hear. And I'm not going to believe it about you that you're a wuss because of what you're going to say. And I know you're not going to believe it about me that I'm a wuss because of what I'm going to say. So we got to back each other up. We got to be dedicated to not being turned around. We can expect that people will try to shame us. Just get ready and go forward and expect it not to be terribly pleasant until afterward, when you have your little after action ceremony, your little briefing, your little celebration, like, wow, man, I was really scared when this happened, or I couldn't believe that somebody said that. But we did it. We got through it. And a lot of people came up to us afterwards, and they will. A lot of people came up to us afterwards and said, man, I didn't have the courage to do what you just did, but I am so glad you did that. Thank you. That's what will happen. And then more and more and more people will join you.
Looking back, Jack, at your radio show, In a Man's Shoes, do you think the discussions on men's issues have evolved much since the 1980s, or are we still fighting the same battles? If not, what has changed? If so, what are things that we still need? What's a focus that we still need to work on?
Well, I think that the main obstacle now is the sort of iron grip that this idea that calls itself feminism has on the American psyche, has on the media, has on our politicians. We need to demonstrate and make clear that feminism is not a progressive social justice organization. It is a big lobby like Big Femma. It's got tens of thousands of professional feminists who are pulling down decent salaries with benefits, doing work that they think is important, and it's a big machine. It is not a progressive organization. It's not a progressive movement. The progressive movement these days, I believe, is the men's movement, at least the part of the men's movement that I belong to, and that I think that most men, deep in their hearts, subscribe to if it was recognized as a real possibility. The Pew Research Centers a couple of years ago found that men, more than women, will say, I do not spend enough time with my kids. Making that happen is probably the most progressive thing that could happen in American society today. And you know how women sometimes say, well, if women ran the world, there wouldn't be any more wars. You know, I don't think that's entirely true.
No.
But even if it were true, there is just as much truth to the idea that if men were more involved with their kids and were equally respected for their opinions about how to raise kids as women claim that they should be, I think kids would be doing a lot better. And it's not because fathers are better, it's because fathers are different. And the whole idea of having two parents is the whole idea of diversity. The more people you have contributing to a decision, the better it's likely to be a decision that everybody can live with and that will work. And if a husband and a wife are really equal and the husband's got one attitude toward how to raise kids and the mother's got another attitude about how to raise kids, and you can imagine what the leanings might be. The man might be more intent on consequences for bad behavior. The mother might be more intent on forgiveness for bad behavior. Both of them have their places. And when husband and wife respect each other, and we don't live in a national dysfunctional family like we do now, and there is a problem with the kid, they will talk to each other and respect each other. And even if they can't come to an agreement, they'll come to a compromise. And they'll say something like, okay, look, let's try it your way first. And if Jimmy is not doing better in 2 weeks, we'll try my approach, okay? And they'll agree if they respect each other, if they really respect each other and don't think, well, I'm the mother, so the way I want to do it is right. Or the man says, well, God damn it, I'm the boss around here. If they really love each other and really respect each other, that's what they'll do.
What do you think a hard truth about gender issues that most people don't want to hear?
That men are every bit as loving, kind, caring, gentle, patient, generative, nurturing as women are. Maybe in a different way, but equally as much. And we need both kinds.
Go into the initiative work on helping men that were in jails and prison. Is that what got you on board? Not just because it is the right thing to do, but we see a lot of men getting put in jail for not paying child support. Now we're starting to see women go to jail for the same. Tell us a little bit about the initiative that you worked with to get men that were subjected to prison and jail a little bit better relationship with their kids.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. I love National Fatherhood Initiative. It's a great organization. The men that I was most involved in trying to help were men. Some of them, of course, were in jail for not paying child support, but many of them, I would say probably most of them, were involved in larger crimes, sometimes violent crimes, sometimes murder, sometimes involved in the drug trade, doing things essentially to make money. Why? Because they're men. What are men supposed to do for their families in the traditional sense? Supposed to bring home some money. And when they can't, what are they? Well, it ain't pretty what they hear they aren't. Those men ain't blank. Fill in your favorite 4-letter word that begins with an S and ends in a T. Those men ain't shit. Why? Because they do not have money. Does any man want to feel like he ain't shit? No man that I know. How do they get to be better than shit? By making money. And sometimes they're so hurt, so desperate, so bereft of love and appreciation and respect that they'll make money by any means necessary. And so that's the kind of men that I think of when I think of the program that National Fatherhood Initiative ran. It was called Inside Out Dad, the purpose of which was to help fathers maintain their relationships with their kids while they were locked up and to prepare to be released and reestablish close in-person relationships with their kids. Now, what's really interesting to me about this program is why the correctional systems, which are hardly rolling in dough, do they devote several thousands of dollars to bring in the NFI, the National Fatherhood Initiative programs, and the books and the pamphlets and the materials and the trainers? Why do the correctional systems spend those resources on a program like Inside Out Dad? The reason is because it is in their own self-interest in two ways. Number one, correctional institutions are largely judged in their effectiveness according to their recidivism statistics. When a man is released, they don't want him coming back. They don't want him to recidivate. That's one thing. And they know that one of the main factors in reducing recidivism is the relationships that the released man has to go back to in his community. If he goes back into his community and ain't nobody loves him, the wife doesn't want him back, the mother of his kids doesn't want him back, everybody's avoiding him, ashamed of him, he's going to go back to the people, places, and things that got him in trouble in the first place. The second reason why the correctional institutions like programs like Inside Out Dad is because it keeps the men focused on better behavior, on trying to stay right, trying to do right, trying to stay clean, trying to not get tickets in the jail, which can deprive them of their visits with their families. And so the point of it is that if you have a man who's given you a problem, the way to that man's heart is through his kids. Why? Because men love as deeply as women do. We just don't get as much time and opportunity and support in doing it.
For our listeners out there, Jax actually sat down and spoke with these men. It's not so much that these men are reoffending because they're the crap of the crop. It is because they have no home life to go back to. Just hearing that from you even sits me down to think about that, because there's a lot of times where I get upset at seeing how much an offender reoffends or look at their rap sheet. But it seems like no one is going to the root, as you've been so gracious to take a step and do that. Thank you. But that people aren't going to the root to find out, what do these poor men have to go back home to? Why should they be better if there's nothing to be better for?
Yes, well, thank you for that. I should say, I have to say, and I'm sure you'll agree and recognize that these issues are multifactorial. And so I'm pointing to the relationships that the men have to go home to as a very big factor. There are many other factors, though. There are some men who are just broken and so angry and so mad that it's going to be really hard to get them not to recidivate. They've done their time and they have to be released, but they're not rehabilitated in any way. They're broken, they're mad, and they don't really have many opportunities. Another factor is that many of the men who are in prison really have no skills. They have been going to really bad schools. They might, even if they've graduated from high school, which is probably a great rarity in many locales, even if they graduate from high school, they might not really know how to read and write and do numbers. So, what opportunity do they have in economically depressed cities or rural areas? What do they have to fulfill their traditional role as men? We need to open up the traditional role of men to include the aspects of human life that have traditionally been regarded as the province of women. Now, this is where the government really has to step in and say things like, if there is a father involved and a mother involved in the lives of these kids, and even if the mother and father don't live together, and even if they don't agree, we are going to protect the father-child relationship as much as we protect mother-child relationship. Now, some people are going to say, well, why should the government protect the father-child relationship where these guys have been criminals? And you just said some of them are so broken. Well, it's a rebuttable presumption. You start with the presumption that a father loves his kids and is good for them, just as we start with a presumption that mothers love their kids and are good for them. But it's also true that many mothers are really not good for their kids because they're strung out on drugs. They are so concerned with the stresses and struggles of trying to hold their home together that they're not good parents either. We need to recognize that that's true for both sexes. And, I think the way to break this cycle is to pay some attention to the parental factor, the parental unit that has gotten such short shrift over the past 100 years, 150 years, and that's fathers. If we devoted some resources, time, energy, and some protection, some laws and customs, and real peer pressure. I mean, like if women would say to a woman who, without justification, kicks the father out of the house away from his kids and doesn't let him see his kids, if instead of the mother's thefts saying, oh, you go, girl, don't let him do that to you. It must have been so hard for you to do that, but we understand why you did that. If the culture were for women to say, you know what, it's pretty clear if you read the scientific literature that kids need both parents. And so who are you really doing this for? Are you doing this for your kids or are you doing it for yourself? And just having women have to face that question from people who they regard as friends could really help to begin to turn this thing around.
But if you could create a mandatory course on masculinity and gender equality for schools, what key lessons would you include in that?
So is it going to be just about masculinity and gender equality, or is it going to be femininity and gender equality?
It's your course. You can create it. If we go back to the root, if we go back into the schools when these children are younger and growing up, maybe that could cause some type of shift.
What age do you want to target? What grades?
Let's go middle school.
Okay, so that's what, fifth, sixth, seventh? That's a very important age because they're just getting into puberty there, right?
That's correct. So it's like 6th through 8th grade.
Okay. The first thing I would do would be to talk to the kids. I would be very interested in talking to the boys about how they feel about being boys. And this would have to be done by really skilled psychologists, really skilled interviewers, because if a person they don't trust says, "How do you like being a boy?" they're not going to open up and say what they think. And one of the questions was, "Do you think boys are treated fairly?" A lot of boys are thinking, well, if I say I don't think boys are treated fairly, is the principal going to find out? I don't think my parents going to be told this. You need to establish some kind of trust and confidentiality and really get to the bottom of how these boys are feeling. But the first thing I would do would be to ask them, try to find out from them, what are your pain points here? In what ways, if you think boys are not being treated fairly, what examples have you seen? And then build a curriculum about that. Do middle school kids hear about toxic masculinity?
I wouldn't say that they necessarily hear about it. I have 2 in middle school right now, and I would say there is definitely social stigmas around being a boy and what their roles are. It's not directly stated or taught, but it's there. It's been there for all of these years. Even when I was in school, Farrah was in school, it just seems to be this cycle that we're stuck in, and it would be nice to break it with conversations like this.
Yeah, it might be good to ask young boys, have you ever seen a shirt or a t-shirt that says girls rule, boys drool? It's going to be in the Museum of the Men's Movement one day. So how does that make you feel? Would be one thing. If we were to go to high school where boys are more likely to hear this idea of toxic masculinity, I would ask them to offer some examples of what might be called toxic femininity. I created a 17-minute video on toxic femininity, primarily because I think just for purposes of full discussion and for maybe also increasing women's empathy for the way men are being treated these days with the onslaught of accusations of toxic masculinity, I created a 17-minute video of examples of what I think is really, really, really corrosive and destructive female behavior. Now, some of it was very rare type of behavior, but just the fact that it could be on a continuum of female behavior where these people are not being condemned in the media and or societally for what they do. It's almost regarded as a joke in some cases. We need to have the courage to say, here's a little saying that works pretty well sometimes. Men aren't perfect, but we're great. Women are great, but they're not perfect. Can we talk about the ways in which men are great? And can we talk about the ways in which women are not perfect? If we can do that, then I think boys at any level would be sort of glad to hear that it's recognized that they're pretty good. And all these girls over here who we see sort of being treated like they're all angels, sometimes they're not. And it's really nice to be able to talk about that because nobody's perfect.
Let's have
Don't
that
just-
conversation, the hard conversations about things that maybe the regular person wouldn't sit in their wine moms group or their guy group at cards and talk about. I do want to go back because your initiative is so important. And I think these days, Jack, with as much as there's crime starting at such a young age, I want to go back. You had mentioned education, like where they're coming from. What role do you think education can play in shaping healthier gender dynamics and reducing social stigma, especially with maybe helping these boys become men in school instead of they go and want to join a gang at 7 because they think that is manly?
Schools need more male teachers. It's low and it's trending lower. So there needs to be some huge effort on the part of, I think, philanthropies would be more likely than the government to start this, but then the government would see that it's beneficial, it's having a good effect, and do what it can do to encourage more men in schools, especially as teachers in schools, especially in the early childhood education years. Imagine if you're a kid who sees very few fully respected men in his neighborhood, certainly doesn't have one in his home, but he goes to school and he has this really nice man who really cares about him and wants to teach him his colors and his letters and his numbers, his alphabet, and reads him stories. And he's a really nice man, and I want to be like him. Well, less chance he's going to want to grow up to be like a thug, right? The values that he portrays and projects are not the hardcore values that are often assigned to men about making money, especially when it's very hard for them to make money. The opportunities are not there. Their skills are not there. Schools need more men up and down the line.
I like that. And you're right. In my high school, there were 2 male teachers, and one was there since like the 40s, 50s. He was retiring. And then the other one was the new band instructor. Other than that, my school had all female teachers. Now, the only thing I can say is back then in the 90s, when I was in high school, it was different. There was not as much talk as the whole toxic masculinity as there is now. I look at boys now and I see them skinnier, scrawnier. They don't have these desires to be firefighters or policemen as much, because look what happens to policemen and firemen. They get bogged down by the societal agendas with different Democrat and Republican stances. But boys in my school took pride in football, running track, being strong and healthy, working on the farm with their family. I lived in a very small town where my graduating class was like 60. It was very small. Well, how has it changed so much from the 80s to now, Jack, as far as the talk? How can we be better women that are raising these boys? Because as you see, a lot of families are, here's an iPhone, here's an iPad. The social media is what teaches our children a lot these days.
I know that Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, is very concerned about the effect of social media and cell phones on kids. To me, the primary problem for boys right now is really low morale. And that's why I created the boysaregreat.shop effort. To me, it seems as if girls have had a 365-day-a-year pep rally about you go girl. You can be anything. Don't let anybody stop you. You're strong. Go for it. So it's you go girl. I think what boys feel like they hear is, boy, don't go there. It's like boys go to a high school with 2 major teams. There's a basketball team, football team. And the basketball team is the pride of the school. Before every basketball game, there's a pep rally, and the school goes wild for the basketball team. The football team, well, not so much anymore. There's no pep rallies for the football team. People don't really think it's cool anymore. Football's not that cool anymore. They don't go to those games. Who am I thinking of? Which sex am I thinking of as being on the basketball team? It's girls. Which sex is on the football team? It's boys. And when you have a pep rally for one team, you can expect it to be doing better, having more fun, being more emotionally exciting, more encouraging than being on the team that gets no love, no attention, no pep rally. But, often the exact opposite of that. Shut up. It's girls' turn now. You've had your turn. It's girls' turn now. Now, the boys today haven't had their turn, because the people who say that are thinking of, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Boys today have never really grown up in a world where there is a ton of self-evident male privilege. And they're wondering, what did I do wrong here? Why am I being blamed here? The incentive, the morale is really sorely lacking. And I know mothers of boys are some of the most effective and dedicated advocates for boys. They're MOBs, mothers of boys. They're very strong advocates for their sons. But when you talk to them, sometimes they'll say, I really can't say much at my son's school because I'm going to get into a fight by saying we need to pay attention to boys. We need to do a better job of making boys feel good about being boys. It's just politically incorrect still. And that's got to change.
Well, I'll tell you, Jack, that got me right in the emotions because I'm mom of boys, and I get that. What would you say to somebody like me? I'm a hardcore boy mom. How can I be a stronger advocate? Or how can somebody who wants to start advocating for underrepresented or misunderstood social groups, what can we do?
Well, I guess like the advice to the boys, this is not going to be easy. You're going to get mocked. You're going to get shamed. You're going to get people jumping in your face, but it will pass. And you will be able to look back with wonderful satisfaction and joy about what you were able to accomplish by breaking down this taboo, a taboo that should never even have been put in place, of daring to talk about how sexism is affecting boys. And it is. And in whose interest is it? It's not really in anybody's interest except the interest of people who think it's in their interest to be mean and vindictive and to get what they perceive as just revenge for all of the injustices that were perpetrated by them when they were little girls. And no doubt there were many, but it's not in anybody's best interest for the future.
Jack, can I piggyback off Cheyenne and what she had said? So there's a lot of women that are stepmothers to a man's children. And in some cases, those women have to be the mother and the father and be a strong parent for this child that's not theirs, but they love them just like they were their own. What words of encouragement can you give if there are stepmothers that are listening right now that feel underappreciated? What kind of advice can you give to them to get that inclusion that they are part of making a boy a man as well, even though it's not their child?
I understand the tribulations. I don't understand firsthand, but I can imagine the tribulations of being a step mom. I think also stepdads probably get something similar.
Of course.
I was dating a woman who had two daughters, and I was with them a lot. What did I hear? Of course, I heard, "You're not my father." And I'm sure stepmothers hear, "You're not my mother." Encouragement, appreciation, gratitude, thank you. I don't know if there are any laws that need to be addressed. I think probably at the level of culture, custom, civility, gratitude, and maybe religion that can all be honored. But really, the most important things we pass down to our kids isn't our genes, it's our ideas. It's our way of looking at life. It's our way of being with each other. It's the way we do relationships. So you as my stepson, you as my stepdaughter don't have my genes, but you got my love. And you can think I'm not really important to you because you don't have my genes, but my ideas, my love, my care for you, and the care that I hope you will develop for me are really what's going to decide whether or not we are a happy family.
And I love that you said that, Jack. Now, when we look at where we are now, and we just covered a lot of topics, are you optimistic about the future of gender relations and societal equality?
Yes, I am. I, I am slowly coming to grips with the fact that it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime.
You're going to have advocates like us, Jack, that are going to try to be on these airwaves and push equality for men and women years on.
100%.
good.
Absolutely.
Good. And I think it's going to take dozens of years, 20, 30, 40 years. The women's movement did not happen overnight. It was a hard slog. But I am optimistic that it's going to happen. It's got to happen. It's going to be good for both men and women. Both sexes have work-life balance, equal shares of both power structures. The male power structure generated money. The female power structure generates love. Both of them are needed for a happy, successful human life. It's going to be good for everybody when we can share them. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not more for me means less for you. It's true that people will not give up power willingly. Men didn't give up their power willingly. It was taken from them at penalty of law. You will not discriminate against women anymore. Women will not give up power willingly that they have in their families and in their homes. But smart people will share power. They will share power because then, with both men and women both having shares in both primary spheres of life, When that's in balance and when it's healthy, then the magic of synergy happens. And it's not just a single pie, static, never growing. It becomes a dynamic machine. It becomes a kitchen. It becomes a whole agricultural industry where we grow more and more happiness and more power for creating happiness with each other. However, though, very small-minded people who are so invested in their primary role in the family that they're going to be tough to budge. I'm suggesting that we don't spend a lot of time trying to budge them, because that's not going anywhere anytime soon. Women like you, who know women like you, as you move out a few degrees of connection, maybe they're less like you, but they are looking toward you. And when they see what you're doing and how happy it makes you and how happy it's working for your school or your family or your kids or your community, they'll be coming your way, and it will grow that way. And then eventually, even the women who are completely invested in I'm the mother will start to think, wow, those other kids seem to be happier.
Jack, our next generation of men and women, what do you think that they need to learn or unlearn to foster healthier dynamics?
Humility comes to mind right away. And I think I would say that so far in the gender equality movement, men have become a lot more humble in the ways they used to be the opposite of humble than women have. I think men have confronted the stereotypes that they were raised with to think about how they were better than women. I don't think women have confronted the ways in which they have been raised to think that they are inherently better than men nearly as well, because I still think many women think in terms of, well, I'm the mother, I'm an angel, men are okay, but they're sort of more like animals. I'm a woman, I create life. And that's another thing that I think needs to be sort of broken down. Women are great, and giving birth is an important, fabulous, wonderful thing, but women don't create life. It's the union of the egg and the sperm that create life. That's where the spark is. It's the union of the sperm and the egg that create the zygote, and the zygote takes it from there. It's the zygote that sends out the umbilical cord to find a supply of nutrients in the uterus. It's the zygote that sort of works the magic. And so it's important to recognize that an egg without a sperm is pretty much like a sperm without an egg. Neither amounts to much. And there's a reason that two people get together in one way or another to create a new life. And that's not by accident.
I love that. That is a great lasting thought, Jack. A lot of times, especially these days where women are so my body, my choice, it's easy for them to say, let me have all of these decisions. I don't think it's a man that needs to be involved in my decision. But yet when someone wants to keep a child, how quickly they are to want a man to pay for that child, even if the man were to say, hey, I'm not ready. Can we talk about this a little bit more? So I'm really glad that you said that you were able to get me to look at both sides today. And I really appreciate that. With some lasting thoughts for our listeners, before we wrap up, Jack, what would you like our listeners to take away from this episode?
That it's a really complicated situation. It's hugely complex. There are a bazillion different factors at play. A lot of emotions are involved, and that really calls forth the need for gentleness, because there are no clear, quick, easy panacea answers. But having the humility to say, look, I might not be right about this, but here's how it looks to me. And I'm not putting anybody on the defensive, not arguing with them, but just saying, here's how it looks to me, and here's how I think about it. And wouldn't that be better? I think that's probably a helpful way to proceed with the discussion, although be prepared for the fact that there are going to be people sort of standing on the side of this conversation, listening, getting angry, coming over and saying, I'm sorry, but I heard what you said, and I have to tell you that I disagree. And then they'll go into some litany of reasons why men are scum. And just be prepared for it and say, okay, sorry you feel that way, and then leave them behind and go to find more open minds.
I think that is a perfect way to end it, with finding open minds. And I'll tell you, damn, If this conversation didn't shake some people up, I don't know what will. Jack, thank you for coming on and challenging the narrative. We appreciate the time that you've given us. Whether you agree with him or not, these are the conversations that need to happen. Jack's work is a vital reminder of the importance of inclusive conversations in creating a more fair and empathetic society. Ignoring one side of the gender equation doesn't solve anything. It just keeps us stuck in the same cycle of division, divisiveness, and misunderstanding. To our listeners, if this episode made you think, rage, or rethink everything you thought you knew, hit the follow button. We're here to stir the pot, and we're just getting started.
And listeners, I will be including all of Jack's info, where to find him, his books, and more will be linked in our show notes, so be sure to check it out and dive deeper into his work. That's a wrap on another inspiring episode of Social Disruption. Don't ghost us. Follow our chemtrails on social media at Social Disruption Pod on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, and TikTok. Over on X at Raw Disruptor.
Spread the chaos. Share this show with your crew. Don't just keep it to yourself. Disrupt someone else's day.
Hell yeah. And we're booking guests who've got something to say, whether it's expertise or wild experiences in world news, entertainment, dating, addictions, mental health.
Or our Day in the Life segment. We want people who make the world tick. DoorDash drivers, plumbers, first responders, retail workers, restaurant, hairstylists. We're done with celebrity sob stories.
Let's hear from you, why you chose your path, what's broken, and what the world needs to know about your grind. So until next time, stay bold,
stay unapologetic,
stay disruptive.
Well, I hope you had yourselves a time.
Next time on Social Disruption, we're back with the Disruption Report, bringing you the latest in sports, entertainment, science, tech, movies, and TV. The war on American farmers continues. Forced closures, government overreach, and the devastating impact on small communities that rely on local agriculture. What's really happening to our farms? Plus, the Department of Government Efficiency has been making strides. We uncover the fraud siphoning away American taxpayer dollars. Where is your money really going? We review Doge's list, and in a shocking revelation, reports are surfacing about Ukraine's military allegedly selling U.S. weapon systems on the black market, including to drug cartels. But that's not all. A whistleblower is beginning to leak explosive details about the attempted assassination of President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. Who does this insider claim is involved? Tune in next time, because Social Disruption is just getting started.